Hey, welcome back to another exciting Stat 300 video, hosted by none other than your friendly neighborhood instructor, Professor Francisco Chima Sanchez. And today we're going to be covering 1.4 experimental design principles, which unfortunately is a bit of a misnomer, sorry, because we're going to be talking about experiments, but also observational studies, which are slightly different in both their scope and what they accomplish, but they both fall under the category of a way to examine and learn about a population or an effect by tracking a variable and its effect on a different variable. So let's start with this. What is an experiment? An experiment is a uh, design that allows us to split our sample into two different groups at least. So we have what we call a control group and an experimental group or treatment group. What's important here is that we're going to have a group of subjects that are going to participate. And it doesn't necessarily have to be people, of course, but for our purposes, we'll discuss it in terms of people. And they'll be sorted into one or the other. And they'll be randomly assigned to one or the other. The overarching framework here is that we're interested in seeing how one variable, say x, affects another variable, y, where we call the variable x the explanatory variable, and y is the response variable. But in an experiment, the explanatory variable has to be compared to a baseline. And that's where the control group comes in. So just for the sake of an example, let's consider a clinical trial, which is um, a broad category of experiments that involves something that is for humans ultimately, and typically in the realm of medicine, pharmacology, psychology, um, to develop and approve treatments um, by a regulatory agency. So, as an example, let's talk about depression. So, there are a variety of medications out that are um, used to treat depression, which is um, a psychopathology. It is a mental disorder, right? It can be characterized by an imbalance of neurotransmitters, and one of these medications that has been approved is one called sertraline. So sertraline is the generic name of one of these treatments. This was approved in the mid 90s, so it's been on the market for a while. Now, this is the generic name as opposed to the brand name, Zoloft. And in order for it to have gotten the approval as a generic drug, and to be clear, even the original brand name had to be approved by the what we call the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and a series of clinical trials to ensure that it's both effective and safe. So what happened in these clinical trials for sertraline is there was a pool of potential participants, willing participants. We'll get into that in 1.5 ethics and statistics. And then they were randomly assigned to a control group or an experimental group. Now, the experimental group, we can split that into more than one group, to be clear. That's particularly of interest to us when we're looking at how much of a certain medication or how much of a certain treatment is gonna be effective, or if we have a comparison of different treatments. Now, in this case, we're going to stick to the basic example of we're just interested if this has any effect compared to the baseline. And what is that effect? So if we're interested in the control group versus the experimental group, right? What that means that we're going to be having a difference in the explanatory variable. So for the purposes of the sertraline clinical trial, we're talking about the presence or absence of taking sertraline. And what's important here for an experiment is we absolutely need to assign the different subjects, the participants, into these groups through randomization. So that's what we call random assignment. Nobody controls or decides who's going to be in which group. Ideally, we also have a couple of other controlling factors. So there's a form in which we can control for different variables by splitting up our original sample, our trial size, and splitting them by a variety of different characteristics, right? We may be talking about racial and ethnic identity. We may be talking about age group, um, sex, gender. We could be talking about the specific kind of depression that they have been diagnosed with. Some people suffer from major depression, some people have seasonal depression, etc. It goes on, right? So when we do that, when we try to block an effect from a what we call a confounding variable, because that happens sometimes. Sometimes we can have a confounding variable that can influence the effect on the response variable without us noticing. And so for that purposes, we may use something called a randomized block design. The randomized block design then is essentially the use of a stratified sample. We stratify um, our participants, our everyone who's going to be a subject in the trial, in the experiment, according to this variable, and then we assign the people in each of those subgroups into a treatment or control group. There's another factor that we may be interested in here, which is what we call blinding. We saw that a little bit when we were talking about the case study for polio, the vaccine that was introduced by Jonas Salk in the 1950s. And what blinding does is it allows us to control for certain external effects, primarily what we call the placebo effect. So if you have simple blinding, that is, you have a treatment that you give to just the treatment group, but then the control group receives something that appears to be the treatment. So they don't know which one is which, right? In practice, it could be something like a sugar pill, right? Or something that looks identical to that treatment. In the purpose of an injection, it could be saline. Um, it's not always possible to blind, but sometimes it is. And so what we're doing there is we're trying to control for the placebo effect. Now, that's simple blinding. That's when the people participating in the experiment don't know whether they're in the control or the treatment group. On the other hand, we can implement double blinding, in which the experimenters themselves also do not know who is the treatment or the control group. And that is to eliminate something called experimenter bias. That's because, like the placebo effect, even the experimenters might have some undue influence in how they administer the treatment that helps give a hint as to whether you're in the treatment or the control group, like a subtle wink or nod. And if the experimenter themselves doesn't know whether they have a sugar pill or the sertraline pill in their hand, then they can't give it away. So those are some elements in an experimental design. And after that, then you compare the response variable between the different groups. And that is what we're going to examine later on how to examine the response, the effect, and the differences in the response variable and whether they are statistically significant. As for an observational studies are different because we have less control over the situation. An observational study necessarily is looking at an explanatory variable and its effect on a response variable, except we cannot randomly assign into a control group or an experimental group. There may be a natural control group and a natural treatment group, but we don't randomly assign. So no random assignment. This is often necessary when there's ethical considerations. For instance, where you're not always allowed to, for instance, give somebody a treatment versus others. One particular case where we get around this is precisely in the context of an experimental, or sorry, a clinical trial. So it would be considered unethical to have a true and proven treatment and withhold that from the members of the control group unless you promise them afterward that if they were not given the treatment after the conclusion of the study and all the results have been tabulated, then they can receive the treatment if they so wish. That's what happened in 2020 during the accelerated clinical trials for the first versions of the SARS-CoV-19 vaccines, particularly the ones by Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and Moderna. So all the participants in the clinical trials were separated into control groups and experimental groups, but afterward, those who wanted to receive the actual vaccine were able to receive it if they so wished. So an observational study typically involves situations where you don't want to interfere with the natural process of what you're trying to study. A classic example would be Jane Goodall and her observational studies of the Highland gorillas in the 1970s. Another instance in which this comes up is if we're talking about, for instance, early childhood education. If any of you are familiar with the Child Development Center here on ARC's campus, we have a center for preschool and daycare that is for infants and toddlers and small children that students can qualify for if they have children of that age and they need childcare for uh, along an income eligibility scale that determines their fees. Um, and what's interesting is that the folks who are taking care of the children are often ECE students. And so they do field study where they are in the classroom working with the children and work on observational studies to understand how the children interact with each other, how they respond to different stimuli, but of course, with the consent of the parents. We'll get into informed consent in the next video, but so that's an instance in which you would want an observational study. Now, there's three different kinds of observational studies that we're interested in this class. The first being what we call a longitudinal study. It is also sometimes called a cohort study. This is where you're tracking the same group of people across across time, right? A classic example is UC Davis's Mind Institute. So this is a ongoing project where psychologists are tracking a cohort of small children from the ages of newborn to 5 years old and beyond, and keeping track of their developmental milestones, both physical and mental and emotional. And so in each cohort, by generation, they're going to be tracking their progress and examining different effects. Uh, so longitudinal and cohort studies, they take time, they take place over time, and you're looking at tracking any changes. The other kind of study that we're in, another kind of study that we're interested in is what we call the cross-sectional study. The cross-sectional study is different groups, but at the same moment in time. So, for instance, if you have a, um, you're interested in learning about a diverse community, such as, say, the A or C student population, we're looking at folks who are non-traditional students, right? Who've returned to take college classes after they've had a career, family, and are wanting to change careers or improve their understanding of something. Then you have your more traditional students, such as, for instance, fresh out of high school students who are seeking to get an associate's degree. Then you have folks who are in dual enrollment programs, who are high school students who are earning college credit. These are different populations, and we may be interested in understanding how different course types, how different pathways, how different instructional techniques differ across these different groups without subjecting one or the other to, a control or an experiment. Just seeing how the disparate groups react. The last kind is what we call a retrospective study. And this is where we are collecting data from the past. And the difference here is that it's not that we don't want to change or to affect who's in the control and who's in the treatment group. It's that we physically can't because all these things already happened in the past. So this typically takes the form of, for instance, performing interviews with people and asking them questions about their experiences from the past. It could be looking through old records like newspapers, magazines, microfilm. Um, it could be examining archaeological records, right? So you're not changing anything in the environment of these things that you're studying or the people that you're studying, but you're still learning from them. There's one last thing that we have to discuss here when it comes to experimental design principles, and it's what happens when we have a Frankenstein of these two different categories of experimental design. And that's what we call the quasi-experiments. A quasi-experiment has elements of both. Sometimes we can introduce random assignment, sometimes we can't. And there's a couple of really interesting ones. So we have the pre-test post-test design. In which we are looking at an interruption. So we have a group of people. We're not separating them into a control or a treatment group, but we initially test them or give them or collect data from them. Something in the intervening time happens. Maybe it's something out of their control, out of your control. Maybe something is applied, like for instance, maybe a new learning protocol, or they take some sort of assessment, and then a post-test where you collect data again from the same people, and you're trying to compare before and after. Another kind of quasi-experiment is what we call the interrupted time series. Again, the idea being you're tracking changes over time. We'll discuss time series in more detail in the next chapter. But essentially, you're tracking changes more on a day-to-day or more of a constant basis, right? Let's say we're talking about things like, for instance, stock prices or daily temperature, right? Things that are changing more fluidly at a shorter time scale. But we're interested in examining how a particular event in time affected this particular variable that we're tracking. One classic example, unemployment. How does certain major events change the unemployment rate, right? One recent uh, interrupted time series quasi-experiment was the examination of unemployment rates at the very, very, very beginning of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, and how that influenced unemployment because of the collective action of governments around the world and the so-called lockdown protocols, in which folks who could work from home were asked to work from home. And there were some essential workers, namely paramedics, nurses, doctors, grocery workers, mail workers, who have to keep doing their job, but um, other folks either lost their jobs uh, or went remote. So that sort of drastic societal wide change is that interruption that we're looking at in the interrupted time series. So just to recap what we're doing here, right? Really fundamentally, this is our picture here. We're interested in how an explanatory variable affects a response variable. And we have a couple of different ways of thinking about how to measure that, all the while trying our best to restrict the effects of a confounding variable. In the next video, we'll discuss some ethical considerations, including the notion of informed consent and what goes wrong when we don't have ethical considerations in statistics. So stay tuned.